Imagine a world where people never bathed, where everyone believed the earth was flat, where science was forbidden and progress simply stopped. Sounds like the Middle Ages, right? Wrong. What if I told you that the so-called Dark Age was actually one of the most important foundations of the modern world? That universities, mechanical technology, banking systems, and architectural masterpieces were born during this very period? Today, we're breaking the first and biggest myth about the Middle Ages. Fact number one, the Middle Ages were a time of innovation. When most people hear medieval, they picture knights, castles, mud, and superstition. But beneath the surface, something revolutionary was happening. During the High Middle Ages, Europe experienced a technological transformation. Watermills and windmills became widespread. These weren't just tools for grinding grain. They powered sawmills, forged metal with mechanical hammers, and automated labor in ways that dramatically increased productivity. For medieval society, this was a mechanical revolution. By the 12th and 13th centuries, mechanical clocks began appearing in European towns. Before that, time was measured by the sun or church bells. Now, complex systems of gears and weights were tracking hours with astonishing precision that required mathematics, engineering, and skilled craftsmanship. Does that sound like intellectual darkness? The birth of universities. Some of the oldest universities in the world were founded during the Middle Ages. The University of Bologna, established in 1088, became a center for legal studies and scholarly debate. Soon after, the University of Oxford emerged as one of Europe's leading institutions of learning. Students studied law, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, and theology. Scholars translated ancient Greek and Roman texts, preserved classical knowledge, and expanded upon it. Medieval classrooms were not silent halls of blind faith. They were places of argument, logic, and structured debate. The idea of the modern university, it was born here. The flat earth myth. Here's another surprise. Educated medieval scholars knew the earth was spherical. The knowledge had been inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Ptolemy. Medieval intellectuals studied their works carefully. Astronomers calculated planetary movement. Navigators understood curvature well enough to plan sea voyages. The idea that everyone thought the earth was flat is a modern myth, not a medieval belief. Architectural genius. Look at the scale of Gothic cathedrals. Consider Notre Dame de Paris or Cologne Cathedral. These structures required advanced knowledge of geometry, structural distribution of weight, and engineering precision. Builders created ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and enormous stained glass windows that filled interiors with colored light. And they built these masterpieces without modern cranes, without digital measurements, without power tools. Construction sometimes lasted decades, even centuries. This was not chaos. It was coordination, planning, and mathematical mastery. The foundations of the modern world. During the Middle Ages, trade networks expanded across Europe and beyond. Guild systems organized skilled labor. Banking practices evolved. Cities grew. Society became more specialized. There were blacksmiths, physicians, scribes, lawyers, merchants, professionals building structured urban economies. This period laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. Without the Middle Ages, there would be no modern Europe as we know it. Closing of Part 1. The Middle Ages were not a black hole in history. They were a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. And this is only the first myth. In the next part, we'll tackle another common belief, that people in the Middle Ages only lived to 30 years old. The truth might surprise you. You'd be dead by 30. That's what people love to say about the Middle Ages. Life was short, brutal, miserable, right? But here's the twist. If you survived childhood, you probably lived much longer than you think. Today, we're breaking one of the most misunderstood statistics in history. Fact number 2, life expectancy was misleading. When historians say that average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 to 35 years, most people imagine adults collapsing at 29 from old age. That's not what the number means. The average was dramatically lowered by extremely high infant mortality. Many children died before the age of 5 due to infections, malnutrition, or a lack of medical knowledge. When a large portion of the population dies very young, it pulls the average down sharply. But if a person survived childhood, their life expectancy increased significantly. A healthy adult who reached 20 could often live into their 50s, 60s, or even longer. 30 was not old age. It was often just the beginning of adulthood. Evidence from real people. We have records of medieval individuals who lived long lives. For example, Thomas Aquinas lived to 49, and that was considered a full, productive intellectual life. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to around 82 years old, an impressive age even by many later historical standards. Even rulers like Charlemagne lived into their 70s. These were not impossible exceptions. They show that long life was achievable, especially among those with stable food access and safer living conditions. So why was life hard? That doesn't mean medieval life was easy. Disease was a constant threat. Without antibiotics or modern sanitation, infections could become deadly. Periodic famines weakened immune systems. Warfare affected certain regions. And then came pandemics, most famously the Black Death in the 14th century, which devastated Europe's population. But even then, survival rates varied. Entire communities rebuilt within a generation. Life expectancy statistics reflect crisis periods, not everyday reality for every individual. Daily life was structured, not constant chaos. Another misconception is that medieval life was constant suffering. In reality, peasant life followed agricultural cycles. Work was physically demanding, yes, but it was seasonal. There were religious festivals, market days, community gatherings, and long winter evenings with limited field labor. In some regions, peasants had more annual holidays than modern workers. Family structures were strong. Communities were tight-knit. Survival depended on cooperation. People married, raised children, learned trades, inherited land, and aged within multi-generational households. This wasn't a world where everyone burned out by 30. It was a society built around endurance and continuity, health and the human body. Interestingly, skeletal studies show that many medieval people were physically robust. Agricultural labor built strong bones. Diets in rural areas, though simple, could be nutritionally balanced: grains, vegetables, dairy, occasional meat. Urban life was generally less healthy than rural life due to crowding and sanitation issues. But again, context matters. A 60-year-old farmer in the 13th century was not unheard of. He would have been respected as an elder, not seen as a biological miracle. The real picture. The myth survives because the number 30 years sounds dramatic, but average life expectancy at birth is not the same as lifespan for surviving adults. If you made it past childhood in the Middle Ages, you had a realistic chance of growing old. Not modern old, but not 30 either. Closing of Part 2. The Middle Ages were not a world where everyone died young. They were a world where childhood was the most dangerous stage of life, but adulthood could be long and meaningful. And in the next part, we'll tackle another powerful myth. Were medieval people dirty and unwashed? Or is that another story we've misunderstood? Picture this. Filthy streets. People who never bathed. cities that smelled unbearable. The Middle Ages, the era when nobody washed, right? That image is everywhere in movies and pop culture. But here's the truth. Medieval people cared about hygiene a lot more than we think. Today, we're breaking another powerful myth. Fact number 3, medieval people did wash. Contrary to popular belief, bathing was not rare in the Middle Ages. In fact, public bathhouses were common across medieval Europe, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries. Cities had designated bathing facilities where people could wash, relax, and even socialize. In some regions of Germany, bathhouses were as normal as bakeries. And this wasn't just for the wealthy. Regular townspeople used them too. Soap, water, and cleanliness. Soap existed. It had been known since Roman times and continued to be produced throughout the medieval period. Soap making became a specialized craft in certain regions, especially around the Mediterranean. Water access depended on location. Rural villages had rivers, wells, and streams. Urban areas built public fountains and water systems. People washed their hands before meals. They rinsed their faces in the morning. Linen undergarments were changed and cleaned regularly, and linen was crucial. It absorbed sweat and could be washed more easily than outer garments. Clean clothing was strongly associated with respectability. The church in bathing. Here's another surprise. The medieval church did not ban bathing. While modesty rules existed, cleanliness itself was not condemned. In fact, many monasteries had washing facilities, and monks followed structured hygiene routines. Monastic rules often required regular washing of hands and faces. Some monasteries even had complex plumbing systems for their time. What about the smell? Now, let's be realistic. Medieval cities did not have modern sewage systems. Waste disposal could be primitive. Streets were sometimes dirty, especially in large, crowded cities. But that doesn't mean people didn't care about cleanliness. Urban authorities created regulations about waste removal. Certain cities imposed fines for dumping trash improperly. And remember, modern cities before the 19th century weren't exactly fresh either. In fact, large-scale sanitation systems only became common centuries later. When did bathing decline? Ironically, bathing culture declined in some regions after the medieval period. During the 16th and 17th centuries, public bathhouses began closing in parts of Europe. There were fears that bathing spread disease, especially after repeated plague outbreaks. Medical theories shifted. Water was sometimes believed to open pores and allow illness into body. So in some ways, late medieval and early modern Europe became less enthusiastic about bathing than earlier medieval society. Hygiene was different, not absent. Medieval hygiene wasn't modern hygiene. There were no toothbrushes, as we know them, no deodorant, no antibacterial soap. But people used herbal rinses, chewed cleaning sticks for teeth, and valued scented oils and perfumes. Archaeological evidence even shows personal grooming tools, combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, carefully crafted from bone or metal. People cared about their appearance. Knights polished armor. Nobles wore clean garments. Merchants maintained professional looks. Being visibly dirty could damage your reputation. The real picture. Were medieval cities perfectly clean? No. Were people ignorant of hygiene? Also no. They lived within the limits of their technology, and within those limits, they practiced regular washing, grooming, and clothing hygiene. The image of the permanently filthy medieval peasant is largely a modern exaggeration. Closing of Part 3. The Middle Ages were not an era of universal dirt and neglect. They were a world with different standards, different science, and different infrastructure, but not a world without cleanliness. And in the next part, we'll confront another dramatic question. Was medieval life nothing but constant war and violence? Or is that another story Hollywood got wrong? When you think about the Middle Ages, what do you see? Knights charging into battle, castles under siege, villages burning. Movies show a world where war never stops, where violence defines everyday life. But here's the question. Was medieval Europe really in a constant state of chaos? Or are we seeing only the most dramatic parts of the story? Today, we uncover another myth. Fact number 4. Most people didn't spend their lives at war. Yes, wars happened. Yes, they could be brutal. But the majority of medieval people were not knights or soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, clergy, and traders. And war was expensive. Kings and nobles couldn't afford endless campaigns. Armies required food, weapons, horses, wages, and logistics. Long wars drained treasuries quickly. Even major conflicts often consist of short campaigns followed by long periods of negotiation, recovery, and uneasy peace. For most rural communities, daily life was shaped far more by agriculture than by battle. Planting, harvesting, market days, religious festivals. These rhythms defined a year more than swords did. The reality of famous wars. Take the 100 Years' War between England and France. It sounds like 100 years of nonstop fighting. In reality, it was a series of conflicts spread over more than a century, with long pauses, treaties, and shifting alliances in between. Or consider the Crusades. While they were dramatic and far-reaching, only a small percentage of the population actually participated. For most peasants in Europe, life continued at home. War was part of medieval life, but it was not daily life for most people. Castles were not always under siege. Castles are often portrayed as permanent war machines. In truth, they were also administrative centers, homes, and symbols of authority. Lords governed territories from them. Legal disputes were settled there. Taxes were organized there. Years, sometimes decades, could pass without a single siege. Knights themselves did not fight constantly. Many spent much of their time managing estates, training, or participating in tournaments, which were highly regulated sporting events, not chaotic slaughter. Violence in context. It's important to be honest. Medieval justice could be harsh. Punishments were sometimes severe. Feuds existed. Political struggles could turn deadly. But public violence was also controlled by strict codes. Chivalric ideals shaped knightly behavior. Religious laws influenced warfare rules. Truces were negotiated during holy seasons. Certain days were declared off-limits for fighting under movements like the peace of God. Society sought stability because stability meant survival. Constant chaos would have destroyed the very system nobles depended on. Everyday life was surprisingly stable. Most medieval people were born, lived, and died within the same region. They married, raised families, inherited land or professions, participated in local traditions. Archaeological records show steady settlement patterns. Villages weren't constantly abandoned due to fighting. Trade routes functioned. Markets operated weekly. Guilds regulated crafts. Economic continuity is impossible in a world of nonstop warfare. And yet, medieval economies grew, especially between the 11th and early 14th centuries. Why the myth exists. We remember wars because they are dramatic. Battles change borders. Kings fall, empires rise. But history books, and especially films, focus on the extraordinary, not the ordinary. A quiet harvest doesn't make for a blockbuster scene. But for most medieval people, that quiet harvest was life. Closing of Part 4. The Middle Ages were not a permanent battlefield. War existed, sometimes intensely, but it did not define every day for every person. Beneath the armor and banners, there was routine, structure, and surprising stability. And in the next part, we'll explore one final myth. Was medieval society completely oppressive and without opportunity, or was there more social mobility than we imagine? Imagine being born into a small wooden house in a medieval village. No money, no noble blood, no connections. Game over, right? In the Middle Ages, your fate was sealed at birth, or was it? Today we confront one final myth. The idea that medieval society was completely rigid and offered no opportunity to rise. The truth is more surprising than you think. Fact number 5. Social mobility was possible. Medieval society was structured, yes. There were nobles, clergy, merchants, peasants. But it was not completely frozen. Opportunities existed, especially in growing towns and expanding economies. From the 11th to the 14th century, Europe experienced urban growth. New towns formed, trade expanded, craft guilds emerged, and cities changed rules. Cities offered freedom. There was a saying in parts of medieval Europe, "City air makes you free." In many regions, if a serf escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day without being claimed by a lord, they could gain freedom. Towns needed workers, craftsmen, and merchants. Skill became valuable, sometimes more valuable than birth. A talented blacksmith, mason, or merchant could build wealth over time. Guilds regulated professions, trained apprentices, and allowed advancement based on ability. The church as a path upward. The church was one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe, and it offered mobility. A peasant son who showed intelligence could enter monastic life, receive education, and rise within the clergy. One of the most famous examples is Pope Gregory VII, who was not born into great noble power, yet rose to lead the church during a critical period of reform. Education mattered inside religious institutions. Literacy was a gateway to influence. Merchants and the rise of wealth. Trade networks expanded across Europe and beyond. Italian merchant families became incredibly powerful through banking and commerce. Consider the Medici family. They began as merchants and bankers, not medieval warrior kings, and eventually became rulers of Florence and major political players in Europe. Economic power could translate into political power. That shift began during the later medieval period. Knights were not always born noble. While many knights were of noble birth, not all were high aristocrats. Some lesser nobles or even common-born individuals could rise through military service, loyalty, or skill. Exceptional service in battle could earn land, titles, or status. Feudal society valued loyalty and competence, especially in times of instability. Limits did exist. Let's be clear, medieval society was not a modern meritocracy. Birth mattered. Land mattered. Family connections mattered. Social mobility was harder than today, but not impossible. And compared to many ancient societies, the growing medieval urban world offered new pathways. The bigger picture. The Middle Ages were not a static, frozen world. They were a period transition. Agricultural systems evolved. Trade expanded. Education developed. Urban life reshaped opportunity. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was already transforming into something new, setting the stage for the Renaissance. Without medieval cities, guilds, and expanding commerce, the modern world would look very different. Final closing of the series. The Middle Ages were not a world of ignorance, a place where everyone died at 30, an era of permanent filth, a non-stop battlefield, a prison with no escape from your birth. They were complex, structured, evolving, not dark, just different. And maybe the real myth is how simple we've made them seem.